Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Today I start a new series called The New Age of Racism. This is where I review several books and resources that forward and explain modern-day racist narratives. The reason I consider these narratives to be modern-day or part of a new age is because they don't come from the typical white supremacist, Klan member, or skinhead we've seen in the past. They come from academia. They come from groups who label themselves as fighters against racism. They come from corporate diversity trainers who make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on racial sensitivity training. They come from authors who write books like the one I'm covering today. These people and institutions claim to fight racism and hate. Many of them do it out of a real place of compassion and they want to make the world a better place. But bad ideas, evil ideas, can find many avenues to infect the minds of good-hearted people. I'm starting this series to expose those ideas and where they come from. Today I'm reviewing Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Antiracist. This podcast is based on a long article I wrote covering this material, but for those of you who have a subscription pass in the Engineering Politics Locals community, you'll get some bonus content at the end where I talk about my experience reviewing the book and a few extra takeaways from the book. But to become a supporter of the Engineering Politics Locals community, you'll need to go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member for free, or get the subscriber pass for as little as $2 per month. And you can use promo code EPFREE for a 3-month free trial of the subscription pass, that's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I'll go over more of where you can find me and support this content after the show. Alright, let's get this started. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. There's a fine line between curiosity and insanity. I learned this when I took up the task of doing a chapter-by-chapter review of Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Antiracist. I was told by some I was doing a good service for diving into, summarizing, and critiquing material that so strongly opposed my morals and political views. It was curiosity that led me down this road. I was told by many more that I was insane for using my time reviewing and criticizing nonsense. I guess it's up to the reader or listener to characterize my efforts to read and review this book. My original intentions were to read and review in a way that would help those who don't want to spend their time reading the book or give their money to people who push bad ideas. And that's still the main goal of mine for doing this. But there's another reason I find this experiment to be more important than insane. I have more motivation than ever to dive into the source material and learn about racial dynamics in America because of a recent email I received from my children's school. This followed the latest rash of police shootings that resulted in the deaths or injury of several black Americans. These shootings created a large social movement to highlight injustices between law enforcement and the black community. It's also important to note, the context for these shootings have largely been ignored, adding fuel to the flames of rage. The social pressure to educate others on perceived injustice has exponentially grown in the past few months, and it's making its way into our children's schools. The email I received from the school addressed these injustices and made a promise to teach the kids about antiracism. To the average parent, this may seem like a sensible strategy to teach kids about how to stand up against racism. And if that's what anti-racism is really about, I'd be all for it. But I now know that is not the end goal of these anti-racist programs. Luckily, my children are too young to take anti-racist programs at their school. These programs start in 5th grade, but these programs teaching my kids bad ideas is not my main concern. Fortunately, I can teach my kids what is right and wrong at home and make sure they do not buy into bad ideas. Unfortunately, my kids are not the ones who will be most negatively affected by anti-racist programs. I guess we can mark that one up to white privilege, because the kids who are really hurt by this are going to be young black kids, or really any kids who will see themselves as victims of a racist society. There is nothing more damaging to a child than telling them the world is out to get them, that the world is racist, that they can never get ahead. We as parents are taught that the best way to help children grow is to encourage, not discourage. Anti-racism programs teach discrimination, victimization, and fear. Advocates of anti-racist education tell us admitting you are a member of an oppressed class is good, and admitting you have privileges that don't come at the expense of others is bad. Consequences as a result of your behavior are seen as the problem with society and not your actions. There is no such thing as a standard because that means people can fall short of it. This is what anti-racism teaches. It creates a darker world for everyone. Reading and understanding bad ideas like anti-racism can help fight back against it. Brushing it off as nonsense and ignorance is not an effective strategy when pushing out bad ideas. Ignoring it will not make it go away. convincing the thought leaders of the anti-racist movement like Kendi is not a great strategy either. Convincing the people who sincerely want to fight racism, and therefore are more open to anti-racist ideology, are the ones we need to help understand what anti-racism really teaches and its roots. Learning the source material for anti-racism and knowing it better than the people who push it is the best way to expose the flaws in the ideology and change minds. This is what I attempted to do with the chapter reviews, and you can find these reviews in the Engineering Politics Locals community. Each chapter has its own set of lessons and objectives. So if you want an even deeper dive into this work, read each chapter review. If you want to spare yourself a little bit of headache, even though I cannot guarantee that you'll not get one at all from listening to something like this, just read the top 8 things I learned from reading the book in its entirety on engineeringpolitics.com, or continue to listen to this podcast. Here we go. Takeaway number 1. The importance of setting up definitions that support the anti-racist narrative. The first step to understanding how any idea operates is understanding the definitions of the key terms. It's impossible to build an understanding if everyone is not using the same definitions, otherwise, you're basically speaking other languages. Kendi starts out every chapter, for the exception of the last few, with definitions of key terms used throughout the chapter. This can be a useful exercise, but it can also help set up a narrative. Kendi uses this to his advantage by defining, or redefining in some cases, words to better fit the context and narrative of the chapter. Even though a single word can have multiple definitions, this raises a red flag for me right from the beginning. To quote the great Thomas Sowell, you can make any claim true if you change the definition of just one word. Kendi starts out the first chapter by defining the most commonly used terms throughout the book, racist and anti-racist. Quote, racist. One who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. Anti-racist. One who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. End quote. Right away I have a problem with these definitions other than the obvious inaction claim. Maybe I'm just a bit OCD or I've had good English teachers in the past, but you're not supposed to have the defining word in the definition of that word. This creates circular logic, although I imagine Kendi didn't do this out of ignorance. Kendi can now define anything as racist so as long as the idea supports a racist policy. But now how do we define a racist policy? The definitions he gave do not actually define anything, but allows enough wiggle room to claim everything can be racist if we think about it deeply enough. Another issue to highlight is Kendi's attempt to manipulate language. He doesn't simply change the definition of the word racist, but he eliminates any neutral position by adding the word anti-racist. George Orwell does an amazing job at explaining this linguistic manipulation tactic in one of his most popular novels. In Orwell's 1984, the appendix goes through the logic behind Newspeak, the new language of 1984 put in place by Big Brother, and Orwell gets very detailed as to why changes were made to language. This was not the words that were changing, or even really the definitions themselves, but it was the elimination of words and their deviations that changed. This may not seem like a big change, but by eliminating certain words, the remaining words' definitions inherently change. For example, the word bad was eliminated because you can just say not good. The word good was still untouched and had its original definition, but eliminating its counterpart changed the spectrum of good to bad to the binary of good and not good. There was no kinda good or kinda bad, just good or not good. Kendi does the same thing here. There is racist and anti-racist and nothing else. Takeaway number 2. Kendi's idea of anti-racism is his own, less sophisticated brand of critical race theory. Kendi is not the first person to come up with this idea, the call to action to find racism in all human affairs, but an idea that is derived from critical race theory, or CRT. Richard D'Angelo and Gene Stefancic define CRT in their book Critical Race Theory: An Introduction. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group and self-interest, and emotions and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. CRT has its foundation based in critical legal studies. I'm not going to dive any further into CRT here because Kendi does not call it out by name much in the book, but he does rely on the accounts and writings from people who are very influential in the CRT movement like Kimberly Crenshaw. To be honest, the ideas in CRT are much more coherent and persuasive than Kendi's attempt at developing an anti-racist narrative, but unfortunately, no less evil in its ideas. To be fair to Kendi, CRT has been around for much longer and is more developed under the critical theory umbrella. And to even be more honest, Kendi's anti-racist ideas are a more dumbed-down version of CRT, which is why it's easier for people to grasp and repeat. Another reason why I won't be explaining CRT here is because it'll take its own series of articles and podcasts to unpack, but it's important to note the relationship with Kendi's brand of anti-racism and CRT. Takeaway number 3. The power of the almighty policy. The term policy will appear about 100 times throughout this book. This is because Kendi rejects the influences of culture and behavior to account for disparities in outcome among different racial groups, so government policy must be the problem and the solution. I often say in many of my reviews of each chapter that Kendi worships at the altar of the almighty policy because he believes in what Thomas Sowell calls the unconstrained vision of human behavior. Sowell explains this idea in his books A Conflict of Visions and The Vision of the Anointed. Basically, there are people who hold an unconstrained vision of human behavior where we can all completely change human behavior through sheer will and proper government policy. And then there is the constrained vision of human behavior where we cannot change human behavior through the means other than organic cultural change or evolution. Because Kendi clearly views human behavior through the lens of the unconstrained vision and therefore believes there is a perfect set of policies that result in perfect equity, he also believes that the racial inequities caused by policy, whether intentional or unintentional, are driven by racist power as he explains here. Quote, "Policies determine the success of groups, and it is racist power that creates the policies that cause racial inequities." End quote. It's almost like Kendi believes there's no such thing as human behavior, just behaviors dictated by policy. This doesn't mean there can't be or haven't been policies created for the explicit purpose of producing racial inequities, but inequities between groups aren't solely caused by bad policy and therefore can't just be fixed with good policy, nor should we use policy to build equality of outcome. The other problem with believing that some policy can save human beings from their own nature and self-interest is who we deem as policy maker. Who's going to be the moral arbiter who guides the benighted people to an anti-racist future? I guess Kendi is volunteering for this role, or at least putting the pieces together to establish the Department of Antiracism in the future, per an article he wrote in Politico, so we can have another bureaucracy tell us how to live our lives. Takeaway number 4. Equity over equality. There's a common sleight of hand used by people who dishonestly talk about race, swapping out the term equality for equity. People who stood for civil rights in the past referred to equality between the races. This is a great idea that basically every American holds today, but recently, equality has changed to equity by dishonest actors. Even though these two words sound similar, they aren't synonyms. Equality is treating everyone fairly, and equity refers to equal or proportionate outcomes. We all want equality, but we know we shouldn't force equality of outcome. The rebranding of equality to equity is a magician's trick for those not paying close enough attention to see the sleight of hand. In order to reach equal outcomes among any groups as large and diverse as black people and white people is to control outcomes. There is a way to organically reach something closer to racial equity, which is to achieve complete cultural assimilation, but Kendi explicitly rejects that claim. Kendi wants to use the power of policy to achieve equity, which also happens to be the primary goal of communism using the same strategy and talking points. The problem with that strategy is there is always a ton of dead bodies along the way to utopia, and the means to destroying evil is using evil itself. Kendi perfectly exemplifies this strategy in the most immoral quote in the book. Quote, "The defining question is whether discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it's racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination." End quote. Kendi openly advocates for discrimination to fight discrimination. We must fight racism with more racism. This is like fighting cancer with more cancer. This is why anti-racism just brings in a new age of racism. Takeaway number 5. There is no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral position. Neutral positions, or what we would call non-racist, are not acceptable in Kendi's worldview, as he explains here. Quote, "There is no such thing as a not racist idea, only racist ideas and anti-racist ideas. There is no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups." End quote. Here, Kendi does what many progressive left ideologues do today. He targets the non-political and people who consider themselves allies who are not anti-racist enough. It's not the openly racist or ethno-nationalists who are the worst racists. It's the store clerk who helps the white patron before the black patron because he clearly thinks the white patron should receive faster and better service. It's also the store clerk who helps the black patron before the white patron because he clearly wants the black patron to leave his store quicker. Either option that is not explicitly anti-racist is to be considered racist. Much like what I said earlier in this podcast, we can claim everything can be racist if we think about it deeply enough. CRT types can define anything as racist if they think critically about it enough. Expelling race-neutral positions and policies will create a world where race is the only characteristic to consider. This is not a world we want to create or live in. Takeaway number 6. Culture and behavior have no influence on each other when talking about inequitable outcomes. This is a central lie you must believe in if you are to be a proper anti-racist. Kendi does everything he can to disassociate race and behavior. To this point, I don't disagree. We should never assume someone's behavior or potential based on their skin color. We should also understand that culture is one of the strongest influences on our behavior. Kendi recognizes that there are differences between cultures, but rejects the notion that one culture can be better than another. Quote, "To be anti-racist is to see all cultures in all their differences as on the same level, as equals. When we see cultural difference, we are seeing cultural difference, nothing more, nothing less." End quote. I don't necessarily disagree with that message, although I would not use the word anti-racist. Cultures have differences, and we should treat them equally as long as that culture doesn't advocate for violating individual rights. But that doesn't mean they will yield equal outcomes. If my neighbor waves to me and I don't wave back, because the culture I subscribe to does not value the return of courtesy, I don't expect to be invited over for dinner anytime soon. That's a small example of how a cultural difference can change an outcome. Kendi also seems to directly tie culture to race, even though the last sentence in the quote I gave suggests otherwise. But here's the thing. Race and culture are indirectly tied through tribalist tendencies built into our behavior. Tribalism, or the behavior of organizing with a tribe, is the link between culture and race. It's the behavior that causes me to love the Green Bay Packers and hate the Chicago Bears. It's also the behavior that causes real Jim Crow-style racism. Tribalism is not always a bad thing, but it can lead to self-selection into groups based on the only characteristics we know about someone before ever meeting them, which is why we see large group adoption of certain cultures. An obvious example of this is rap and R&B being the music of choice for many, if not most, Black Americans. This doesn't mean this is a strict rule, but we do see a disproportionate large-scale adoption of this cultural tendency by one racial group. And while we are on the subject of cultural differences in race, Kendi doesn't talk about cultural appropriation, or the adoption of cultural elements your subscribed culture does not own. But going on the assumption culture is just culture and not directly tied to race, cultural appropriation shouldn't be a problem. We are now seeing a major breakdown in logic, but it doesn't end there. Kendi must then separate culture and behavior to complete the lie. Quote, "Anti-racism means separating the idea of culture from the idea of behavior. Culture defines a group tradition that a particular racial group might share, but that is not shared among all individuals in that racial group or among all racial groups. Behavior defines the inherent human traits and potential that everyone shares." End quote. Separating culture from behavior goes against everything we know about human behavior and what influences it. Per Kendi's quote, "Culture defines a group tradition." This already debunks his previous sentence. Traditions, such as religious beliefs, are the strongest factors in influencing our behavior we have as human beings. Behavior defines the way we act or conduct ourselves. It doesn't define inherent human traits or potential everyone shares, unless you're going to make some very loose connections with some mental gymnastics. This completely illuminates Kendi's belief in the power of the policy. If culture, tradition, and belief have no relevant influence on our behavior, then making policy changes is the most obvious avenue for permanent behavioral change. Human beings are unconstrained by human behavior, according to Kendi. Takeaway number 7. Capitalism is what stands between us and an anti-racist utopia. Economics doesn't tend to be a strong subject for most critical theorists, and they rely on the reader's ignorance on the subject to play to their advantage. To be fair, economics isn't the easiest subject to understand because it isn't something you can hold in your hand, yet it has its own personality and somewhat erratic behavior. But people who want to change the world understand that systems that allow people their own autonomy and give them the tools to make their own lives better do not rely on the saving graces of an intellectual elite. A free market is the most efficient and effective way to bring prosperity to the largest amount of people, and is a system where to become powerful, you must provide more value to the general population. In a fixed market, or a more socialist economic system, the powerful are the intellectual elite who claim they can run your life better than you can. And a quick note before I move on. I'll do my best to quickly summarize Kendi's thoughts on capitalism's role in racism, but there is a ton to unpack here. I won't be able to get to everything he covers, so I recommend you read the Chapter 12 review on class, which is broken into 2 parts due to the volume of material I had to cover, for the full breakdown. If you're going to read any of my chapter reviews, I strongly recommend this one. Kendi only covers economic systems in one chapter, but fills the chapter with every dishonest argument against a free market you can think of. Right from the start, he defines terms that already form an Orwellian narrative. Quote, class racist. One who is racializing the classes, supporting policies of racial capitalism against those race classes, and justifying them by racist ideas about those race classes. Anti-racist, anti-capitalist. One who is opposing racial capitalism. End quote. First, class racism is a real term that has nothing to do with racial capitalism, but has everything to do with real racism. It's simply just breaking races into classes of people. Markets can be fixed to the benefit of certain classes, as we've seen with economic fascist movements and communism, but free markets are not geared towards creating class. Class breakdown is a qualitative breakdown of groups based on relative wealth standing. Wealth is accumulated through the marketplace, but rigid class structures can only be dictated in a fixed market where inputs and outputs are regulated and controlled. A free market inherently has no control over inputs and outputs, but rather puts that control in the hands of the consumer and producer. This doesn't mean a free market acts morally or creates its own moral systems, something disputed by the more Ayn Randian school of economics, but it doesn't selectively create classes of people. Secondly, he defines the term anti-racist, anti-capitalist without defining the term racial capitalist, but defines it juxtaposed to class racist. This seems to imply anti-racist, anti-capitalist is good and class racist is bad, something I would categorize as both being bad. He also leaves no room for an anti-racist capitalist category, something I'm sure he did on purpose to set the narrative. This follows the logic I described earlier in the podcast about the Orwellian newspeak strategy of changing language by reducing the dictionary down to the words only the ones in power want you to use. Kendi also makes a popular claim that capitalism is what allowed slavery and racism to thrive in America. He explains how capitalism intersects with other oppression narratives. Quote, I saw poor blacks as a product of racism and not capitalism, largely because I thought I knew racism but did not know capitalism. But it is impossible to know racism without understanding its intersection with capitalism. Capitalism emerged during what the world systems theorists term the long 16th century, a cradling period that begins around 1450 with Portugal and Spain sailing into the unknown Atlantic. Prince Henry's Portugal birthed conjoined twins, capitalism and racism, when it initiated the transatlantic slave trade of African people. These newborns looked up with tender eyes to their ancient siblings of sexism, imperialism, ethnocentrism, and homophobia. End quote. Kendi defines the origins of capitalism through the lens of world systems theory, which is an approach to world history and social change that suggests there is a world economic system in which some countries benefit while others are exploited. So, basically, Kendi starts out his understanding of the history of slavery the same way a Nazi would start out his understanding of the history of the Jews. If you start with the assumption that we are all playing a zero-sum game, and therefore, there must be someone taking advantage of someone else during every transaction, of course you're going to end up believing in some silly stuff. The upsetting part about this is Kendi is not alone in this deception. World systems theory is being taught in many schools and higher education institutions, propagandizing kids and young adults before they enter the marketplace believing no matter what they do, they are just being exploited for their labor. Kendi continues his anti-capitalist rant, citing Karl Marx and Howard Zinn several times, exposing his lack of knowledge of understanding the real role free markets took in ending slavery. And yes, you heard me correctly. Capitalism was one of the leading ideas, along with Christianity, that led to the end of slavery. I wrote a ton of information on this topic and will not restate it all here for the sake of length, but I would, again, strongly recommend you read the Chapter 12 review. But, real quick, I'll give you two obvious reasons why we know free markets helped end slavery. 1. A worker who is paid no wage has no incentive to innovate, become more efficient, or have the means to purchase products he or she made or other slaves made, thus decreasing the pool of potential consumers and leads to inefficient production, something no capitalist wants. And 2, almost every slaveholder in the American South was openly against free markets. Economic historian Philip W. Magnus of the American Institute for Economic Research, who I use as a source for much of my historical economic arguments against Kendi's claims, said it best when describing the common ground between slaveholders and socialists, stating, "The immiserating historical records of each reveal that the only remaining distinction between their political outcomes consists of the choice between slavery of the plantation and slavery of the gulag." Takeaway number 8. If one oppression narrative is not strong enough, then combine several oppression narratives to build more oppression capital. Kendi has several chapters in the latter third of his book that covers other oppression narratives not directly tied to race, such as feminism, gender, and sexual orientation. But in the true tradition of someone who trades in oppression capital, Kendi will tie them all together anyways. He's even kind enough to give us more definitions to follow because keeping track of how these different narratives intersect can get kind of confusing, on purpose I expect. Quote, "Gender racism. A powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race genders and are substantiated by racist ideas about race genders. Gender antiracism. A powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to equity between race genders and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about race genders. Queer racism. A powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race sexualities and are substantiated by racist ideas about race sexualities. Queer anti-racism. A powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to the equity between race sexualities and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about race sexualities." End quote. Per Kendi's usual arrangement, there's a perfect set of policies that will balance equity between race genders and race sexualities. Do you know what that means? Neither do I, and I don't think Kendi really knows either. I will cite an example from his book of how crazy this logic gets. Quote, "I am a cisgendered black heterosexual male. Cisgender meaning my gender identity corresponds to my birth sex, in contrast to transgender people, whose gender identity does not correspond to their birth sex. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections. To be queer anti-racist is to serve as an ally to transgender people, to intersex people, to women, to the non-gender conforming, to homosexuals, to their intersections, meaning listening, learning, and being led by their equalizing ideas, by their equalizing policy campaigns, by their power struggle for equal opportunity. To be queer anti-racist is to see the policies protecting black transgender women are as critically important as the policies protecting the political ascendancy of queer white males. To be queer anti-racist is to see the new wave of both religious freedom laws and voter ID laws in Republican states as taking away the rights of queer people. To be queer anti-racist is to see homophobia, racism, and queer racism, not the queer person, not the queer space, as the problem, as abnormal, as unnatural." End quote. This pile of word salad is only useful in highlighting the profound insanity of critical theory and intersectionality. Dr. Jordan Peterson summarized it best, and I'll paraphrase. These infinite intersections and identities become so unique that it splits every person into an individual of their own unique identity. This creates individuals, not groups, that the typical conservative and classical liberal stands up for. Using their logic, we should all be on the same page, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Calling out religious freedom by name only serves in illuminating what really drives this movement: politics and power. This dishonest deviation of Marxist class struggle only separates us in order for the ideology to thrive. The ideology feeds on disorder and chaos. Kendi finishes this idea by telling a story about a few radical black feminists he met in college who go out and attack anyone who does not conform to their rigid ideology. Kendi literally uses the word attack to describe what these oppression fighters are doing. Kendi writes, quote, "I call them attacks, but in truth they were defenses. Defending black womanhood and the humanity of queer blacks." End quote. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, so I get it. But when on the attack in an intellectual bout, we must agree to be substantive and not attack character. This isn't a rule critical theory agrees to. In fact, violating this rule is vital when defending the ideology. As Kendi continues to say, quote, "But I call them attacks because I felt personally attacked." End quote. This means, agree with me or you are evil and racist. Submit to my ideas or face my wrath. This is how you get cancel culture. This is how you destroy civilizations. The main point here is these different oppression narratives will run side by side and combine when needed. This is a strategy that comes from critical theory and the different sub-theories that derive from it. These critical race theory types reject capitalism and the idea of monetary capital, but are accepting of fixed economic outcomes and social capital. Oppression capital is a type of social capital that is exchanged for power since monetary assets aren't as useful in a fixed market. You accumulate oppression capital by making claims you, or a group you are allied with, are oppressed. The greater the perceived oppression, the more oppression capital is accumulated. What this incentivizes is not solutions to fight oppression, but to find different ways to claim more oppression. Being black in America makes you a part of a perceived oppressed class, but not as oppressed as a black woman, who is not as oppressed as a black transgender woman, who is not as oppressed as a black transgender lesbian woman, who is not as oppressed as a black transgender lesbian handicapped woman, and the list goes on and on. There is no future that we find solutions to end oppression because the oppression goldmine will run dry. This is a game, not real life. These are the main takeaways I gathered from reading How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi. But to get a better idea of what the book is about, read my reviews. But the best way to understand Kendi's ideas is to read the entire book yourself. I don't normally advocate for people to give their money to other people who push evil ideas, but knowing the source material of the thing you're fighting against better than the people who are fighting for it is the most effective strategy in winning the battle of ideas. The other important element in fighting against this style of racism is having the courage to call it out. If your children's school is sending you emails about anti-racism courses, send a kind and informed response letting them know you don't approve of this type of propaganda. If your place of work is asking you to take anti-racist training, tell them you don't find this to be valuable or proper training for a professional workplace. Or if you run the risk of getting suspended or terminated if you reject the training, attend the training and ask tough questions. No matter how you push back, make sure you know the source material, preferably better than they do. Expose the logical errors and illiberal ideas needed to accept anti-racist narratives. Kendi wants to create an anti-racist utopia where all we care about is race. People like Richard Spencer probably agree with much of Kendi's ideas. This is because the radical left and the radical right are the same people. They share a common ideology. Trade individual liberty for collective security. Relieve yourself of the burden of accountability and allow a centralized power to run your life. Hierarchy should be built on characteristics like race rather than ability or competence. Every human interaction is a struggle for power. This is the utopia they want. Don't give it to them. This concludes this podcast on The New Age of Racism, How to Be an Anti-Racist Review. If you have access to the bonus content, stick around for more. If you don't have access to the bonus content, join the Engineering Politics Locals community today and get yourself a subscription pass. You can do this by going to engineeringpolitics.locals.com and becoming a member. That part is free for everyone and will keep you up to date with my newest content, as well as posts and conversations within the community. But to participate in those conversations, get access to the full content library, including the bonus content at the end of this podcast, get to watch the subscription-exclusive EP Zone show, and even post your own content, thoughts, and ideas to the main feed, you have to become a subscriber. Subscriptions start as low as $2 per month, and now you can get a 3-month free trial when becoming a subscriber if you use promo code EPFREE. That's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I would love to have your support with your subscription so this content can remain independent and keep growing. This is the best way to support this content, but there are many other places you can find me. You can follow me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can also give me a follow on Parler at Engineering Politics. You can also become a subscriber to my video channel on YouTube under the name Engineering Politics, where you can find the video version of each podcast. I'm also active on ThinkSpot, which is a discourse-generating application that promotes intelligent and honest conversations while discouraging trolling and nonsense found on most social media platforms. You can send donations there as well. Alright, bonus content time. And if you aren't hearing any bonus content right now, that means you aren't a subscriber yet, but I hope you become one soon. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.